Relations between the United States and China have fallen to their lowest point in decades. It's interesting to remember that Richard Nixon once said of China, "We have created a Frankenstein." And just last week, in his very first press conference, Secretary of State Tony Blinken said of China, "It is arguably the most important relationship that we have in the world going forward." Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first program in our Focus on China series here at the World Affairs Council. I'm Jim Falk, president of the council. And our guest today is Luc Patey, the author of How China Loses, the pushback against Chinese global ambitions. And he takes a critical look at how the world is responding to China's formidable rise. But before we get to Luc, let me remind you that you can always purchase copies of books that are featured at the World Affairs Council by going to our Dallas-based independent bookstore, Interabang. Just go to interabangbooks.com and type in the code dfwworld, and then you'll get 10% discount for the books China Loses, as well as any books that might be in your shopping cart. And once again, I see as our series sponsor, Maisie Heiken. Maisie's a member of our board of directors, and Maisie, I'm sure you're watching, and we're just so grateful to your support. And if you'd like to support programs at the World Affairs Council, please give me a call and we'll work that out. You can do that by making a contribution for each program of either $500 or $1,000. I do want to remind you that our next program in our Focus on China series will be on Thursday, February 18th at 6 p.m. Central Standard Time. We're going to be talking about Made in China, a prisoner, an SOS letter, and the hidden cost of America's cheap goods. The author of that book is Amelia Pang. She's a journalist, and really pleased that moderating that conversation will be Amanda Schnitzer, who did so much good work at the Bush Institute here in Dallas, working on human rights and the center's freedom agenda. And as always, you can keep up with all of our programs by going to our website at dfwworld.org. And if you've missed one, I hope you'll go to our YouTube channel. You can subscribe. And of course, please share it with your friends. So as I mentioned, Luc Patey is with the Copenhagen, he earned his PhD at the Copenhagen Business School. He's originally from Canada and moved to Denmark, I think about 15 years ago. And his writings have appeared in the New York Times, the Financial Times, and the Guardian. I had the chance yesterday to read some of these, really very interesting, especially those in the Financial Times. I know we'll be talking about your work in Africa, but I really did enjoy those articles there. So again, Luc, thanks so much for joining us, and looking forward to our conversation, and also expect to see lots of questions from our viewers.
Thanks so much, Jim. And it's really a pleasure to be here. And thanks for the World Affairs Council for the invitation.
You know, you really did take a different approach. So much of what we read in the United States is, I guess it gets back to Graham Allison's book, The Thucydides Trap. You know, will there be a military conflict? And it's always viewed through the prism of China and the United States. But you really looked at China's relations, particularly economic, around the world. I'd like you to tell our viewers more about the research that you did, some of the interviews, and just the overall format of your study.
Sure. Well, it started where I left off my last book, which was in South Sudan and Africa. And there I noticed, that China was becoming more influential, having a bigger presence, not only in South Sudan, but throughout the African continent. And I wanted to understand this more closely. So I decided that I would, travel around to different parts of the world and try to understand the question of how China deals with problems when it encounters them abroad. Because China's, global presence has really expanded significantly since the turn of the century. So I wanted to get a feel for that. And I did that by following what China's doing in its trade and investment and its finance overseas. So it's economic outreach, because that's really, I think, still the largest sort of international engagement that China has at the moment is its trade principally and its investment. And I did that by looking, by going to Argentina, by going to East Africa, but also here in Europe, and speaking with not only Chinese officials based abroad and Chinese managers, but particularly I wanted to get the sense for the local perspective on China, whether in South Sudan, South America, or around Europe, and also in East Asia. And the reason I wanted to get this local perspective is because when I encountered China in most newspapers, in research, and also in government discussions, particularly in the US and Europe, it has tended to be a focus on the China-US relationship. And I became somewhat frustrated with that, because what often fell through the cracks were China's relations with other countries in the world, significant major powers, or middle powers, we call them, like India, the European Union, Germany within the EU, or France, Australia, Canada. And I wanted to understand these relationships, because as significant as the US-China relationship is, the rest of the world matters, I think, deeply to the future of the global economy and the future of international affairs. If you think of it, the US and China together represent around 40% of the global economy today. They command the two most powerful militaries, and the current strategic cooperation between the two is really going to shape our lives and the lives of our kids for quite some time. This is a serious competition or rivalry that's underway. But at the same time, you still have 60% of the global economy, other major militaries, other technological advanced countries, other cultural hubs that are also shaping global affairs and the global economy. So I principally wanted to take a look at that other 60%, the 60% we don't as often hear about.
One of the things I thought was interesting is that you were able to interview a lot of diplomats in the different countries you went, Chinese diplomats. Were they receptive to that? And do you feel you got the straight story?
It takes time. I think, when you're covering China, both within China and outside of China, these are difficult meetings to get. And you have to spend significant time writing emails and knocking on doors and the usual work that researchers and journalists do. But I found that Chinese officials, once you sort of got a foot in the door, were quite sort of straightforward and in their discussions with me. In places like Argentina, for example, China is bringing in large infrastructure projects, railway projects, hydropower dams that Argentina has asked for. So China, I think, these officials very much see their presence in these countries as a good, positive thing. And there are, China has shown a lot of successes, particularly in the developing world. And I also found that, just in the time that I've been doing research on China, the past 10 years or so, that they've become much more outspoken, Chinese diplomats and other officials, and more willing to defend their presence, and more willing to discuss and debate some of the problematic sides of their presence as well.
One of the things that I also found interesting was how you really sort of trace Xi Jinping's transformation from the way he was when he was first brought in 2013 to where he is now, which is certainly, I think most people would agree, authoritarian tendencies.
Yes, I mean, President Xi has changed. Our opinions and perspective of him in the United States and Europe has changed quite dramatically since he came into power in 2012, 2013. As the chairman of the Chinese Communist Party, and then after China's president. Many Western commentators originally saw him as a potential reformist, and reforming China in the direction of a more liberal economy, and even possibly some political reforms. Certainly not necessarily towards a more democratic China, but an opening up and a more open engagement and cooperation within the US-led international liberal order at that time. That turned out obviously not to be the case. Many people in the US and Europe got Xi wrong. He did quite the opposite. In his initial years, he really spent significant amounts of time solidifying his power in China through a massive anti-corruption probe, which took down hundreds of thousands of officials and company managers from sort of the bottom of the Chinese Communist Party to the very top. And so he really solidified his power at home. And then in 2013 or so, started to push out abroad as well, and to really demonstrate a more assertive, at times even aggressive Chinese foreign policy, whether it was in the militarization of the South China Sea or the sort of ambitious Belt and Road Initiative, which has plans to build hundreds of billions of dollars of infrastructure and trade links and industrial corridors.
Yeah, we're going to spend quite a bit of time talking about that. Well, about the Belt and Road. It's interesting that rooting out corruption can sometimes be a foil for people to get more power. I'm thinking of Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, there was a mix. I mean, people debated, whether his goal was to actually get rid of corruption in the Chinese Communist Party, and he saw that, and I think the Chinese Communist Party leadership does see that as a potential threat to their power. But at the same time, a lot of the individuals that came under his graft net happened to be also what can be considered sort of political opponents within the Communist Party, such a man like Zhou Yangkang, who was on the Politburo of sort of the top leadership of the Chinese Communist Party. He was arrested. Bo Xila, who was a leader in Chongqing, China's big western city, was also arrested. So we saw a lot of these rivals to Xi suddenly end up in jail as well. So I think it was a little bit of both. But it's also interesting to note that Transparency International, their ranking of countries and their levels of corruption for China hasn't really changed since Xi Jinping came into power. So it seems like the corruption didn't really change, but the people in power did.
Nick Kristof had a piece in the New York Times a few days ago, and he said one thing that the Biden administration should be cautious about is not assuming that Xi has tremendous support, that there are people who are uncomfortable with him and will criticize him in private. How solid do you think his support is?
It's hard to say. I mean, it's a pretty obscure box to try to get a look in. I wouldn't call it completely a black box, but I think at the moment I would sort of venture that his support is still quite strong within the Communist Party. I think there were some jitters when the COVID-19 pandemic began in China. He sort of stepped out of the spotlight for several weeks. And people were saying that he should be sort of responsible for the outbreak in Wuhan. But China has quickly turned that around. They've done quite an impressive, although with harsh methods, an impressive sort of lockdown on the country in the initial month or so, and managed to get rid of much of the pandemic. Most Chinese people are living a normal life, a sort of a pre-pandemic life.
Why do you think they've been so successful on reducing the pandemic?
Well, I think, the methods they use, sort of very harsh lockdowns, people not being able to leave the house particularly in Wuhan and Hubei province, they really stamped out the virus early on, and that's sort of what we all I think needed to do early on, not necessarily with the same methods, but to take it very seriously from before it started to spread. And it's important to note that China has not been the only country that's been successful at doing that. Right now, there are rock concerts in New Zealand, and democracies such as Taiwan, Australia, New Zealand, South Korea have also handled the pandemic quite well. So it's not just something that favors authoritarian regimes, but China was successful, I think, not only because of the measures it took, but because I think people generally responded. They understood the risk. They lived through the SARS outbreak in the early 2000s. So that experience, which I think also helped countries like South Korea and Taiwan, plays a big role in the response. And we can imagine and hope that if we are encountered with such a pandemic again in our lifetimes, that our intelligence experience towards stopping it early on may have improved. We can only hope.
I'm hoping it'll be, if I never want it to be, but if so, in another 100 years. One of the things that I've always thought is that China's efforts have been to have the strongest economy in the world. And it was really focused on business relationships. But I'm getting the sense from reading your book and other commentators is that now the Communist Party is putting more emphasis on exporting its ideology. And I wonder if you agree with that. And again, before you respond, let me remind everyone that they can go ahead and ask questions, submit your questions, and we'll weave them into the conversation. But what do you think about the ideology?
It's a good question. And in American China, in the US, in China studies and elsewhere, there's a debate about how serious is the Communist Party about spreading autocracy overseas. The way I see it is twofold. Firstly, China is doing it directly through training of political parties in different parts of the world, in Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia. So bringing, of course, before the pandemic, bringing political parties and media to training and lectures in China, covering subjects like how to control public opinion and others. So there's this direct sort of engagement on sort of sharing the Chinese governance model with others. Secondly, though, I think the sort of legitimacy that China has won in many parts of the world through its rapid development has sort of an indirect way of spreading or at least legitimizing and encouraging countries to emulate China's development model. And so this, it's sort of like a follow of the leader mentality. Another way I think that China is sort of, again, indirectly spreading its model is through its international finance. And sort of a lot of its finance comes with stipulations that, if an African or a Latin American country takes on a large loan, that they also ensure that there won't be public bids on the loan and other sort of transparency mechanisms that might be in place in local law are changed. And countries, some countries have changed these laws to take on that finance. And that also has a way of rolling back democratic norms. So I would take it seriously. I don't think China has a front and center plan to make the world more authoritarian, but just its expanding presence has that influence.
I don't want to be guilty of gross generalizations, so let me phrase it this way. Could you take an example of where the Belt and Road Initiative has worked very well for all parties in Africa, and then maybe where it hasn't, say what's happened in Djibouti or the railroad in Nairobi?
So I think China, is on the Belt and Road, which, its initial thrust was very much infrastructure, new railways, new ports, new roads. It is sort of helping to fill a gap that's out there. Africa as a whole needs over $1 billion or $100 billion of infrastructure every year. Asia needs $1.7 trillion in new infrastructure every year to continue its economic growth and adapt to climate change. So there's a massive infrastructure gap out there in the world, and China alone can't fill it. But this Belt and Road Initiative helps to do so. So I think in terms of positives, I think the roads that China is building are particularly good for local economies. They connect within cities. You know, I traveled a lot to Juba in South Sudan, and the only paved road, when I first arrived there, I think in 2006, the only paved road was from the airport to the main city, and that was built in 1972. And just after 10 years or so, China and other contractors, African and international, you know, built up quite a few roads within the city, and even have started to work on connecting different towns. So I think roads make a difference. Now,
are these roads well built?
Yes, it's a good question. I mean,
that's one of the things that I've read. One, you know, they're not very well built, well maintained, and of course the labor largely has come from China, so that the benefit does not go to the indigenous population.
Sure, there's a couple of things to unpack, I think, there. So I think unlike European and Korean construction companies working in Africa and other parts of the world, there's a great variability between Chinese construction companies. So you get the road you paid for. You get the road that if you pick sort of one of the companies that has a better reputation and you pay more, you'll get a decent road. But it's true that particularly in countries heavily affected by rainy seasons, that a lot of the Chinese roads haven't lasted long. And this is, you know, countries like Angola and elsewhere. South Sudan has also had cases of this. And we'll see, you know, infrastructure, the wear and tear on infrastructure and the cost of maintenance of infrastructure can sometimes over time exceed the initial construction. So this is still sort of an unfolding story, but the basic message is that China has a variety of companies in construction. But I think, you know, the idea that China is using its own labor for sort of very sort of low-skilled tasks like road building is a myth in a certain way. I mean, it also depends on the country. So I think many Chinese construction companies will come to an African country with a contract that firstly puts everything in their favor. So that, and many large Chinese state-owned companies, they have excess labor at home that they would love to get abroad working. So if an African government in response doesn't try to renegotiate those terms, doesn't sort of push its labor laws, then this will be the case that more Chinese labor comes in. But I think studies have shown that when it's sort of low-skilled labor, it is still mostly locals. But at the managerial level, then it's Chinese.
What about on the subject of corruption? I know people who work here with some of the large companies, and they're very concerned about Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. I think you can say that most American large multinationals stay on the straight and narrow path, but that Chinese companies aren't under the same restrictions. And again, you point out in your book that there's been some instances where there have been very large contracts that have been inked way above what they should have cost. So that's bound to have a pushback from, at least one would hope, some of the African leaders or the populations.
Yeah, I think so. You know, the problem with the Belt and Road, one of the other problems with the Belt and Road is that it's exported Chinese corruption along with it in many cases. And we see this in Africa, but also in Latin America and Southeast Asia. And, you know, it takes two to tango. There are also local officials that are involved in those deals. And with a major railway project in Kenya connecting Nairobi with Mombasa on the coast of the Indian Ocean in East Africa, there were several corruption allegations put towards the Chinese company involved and Kenyan officials. Another, I think, sort of blatant example is in Malaysia. And there in Malaysia, there was a change of government at the time when China was building tens of billions of dollars in infrastructure projects. And the new government under Muhammad Mahathir, who's no longer prime minister, but had long served as Malaysia's leader, they were able to renegotiate one major high-speed railway deal by bringing it down to a third, so from 15 to $10 billion. So that's not a small haircut, and this was caused by the fact that the previous government had engaged in quite a few corrupt dealings with Chinese, but also with other international financiers and investors. So you saw, close to $10 billion of deals in Malaysia get cut when the new government came in and sort of checked the papers and changed things. And it really shows that, the willingness of Chinese state-owned companies to engage in corruption is there. And so is the willingness of other, international investors in some of these countries and of local officials. So it can be a major issue for countries that if they take on this debt, this large amount of debt, and a large portion of that, or a notable portion of that is taken away by corruption, then that's going to drag down the economy for some time.
So we often hear talk about the debt trap, and of course that was a big issue, I guess, in Sri Lanka with the port, but it's been an issue in other countries and projects as well, where China has provided the funding. Give us some examples of that, and I think it'd also be good to know how COVID-19 has perhaps made that worse.
Yeah. So definitely the debt trap diplomacy that has been thrown at China has definitely sort of caught on, particularly in the US and in different parts of the world. And this allegation was initially thrown at the Belt and Road through a port deal in Sri Lanka, where Sri Lanka was unable, Sri Lanka was suffering from sort of high debt levels, and in order to alleviate those, it sold its equity stake in this port to the Chinese company, and that began to worry people not only in Sri Lanka but throughout Africa and
Well,
South.
you said they sold. I mean, did they have a choice?
Well, yes, they had a choice in the sense that, this was the asset they decided to sell. So the main point is that, I don't think their hands were tied on this particular asset. And my point is that the debt trap idea, I think is a little bit over the top. I don't think there's necessarily a plan from the Chinese side to ensnare countries in such deals. That being said, the Chinese side will definitely use its leverage to gain more when countries can't pay back their debt. It's important to note too that China is a new and large provider of finance abroad, but it's not the only one. And a lot of these countries have large debts with multilateral lenders and other bilateral lenders. But China came into these countries offering new finance, often at higher interest rates, but countries took them on. So this is sort of more of willfully stepping into a trap.
So buyer beware.
Yes, yeah, I would say that. I mean, but also to be, I think, to be critical of China's approach as well, we need to understand too that China, came into this knowing that these countries had sort of already, severe debt problems, and they added to that, and that they're not ones to forgive debt. China often extends debt payment periods or waives interest for a time, but they also have taken advantage of the fact that they want if the country can't pay its debt, they would like to get equity in the project, or they would like, for instance, a railway in Argentina. If Argentina can't pay the debt to that railway, then China will take the revenues of the railway instead. So they don't take ownership of the asset, but they take ownership of the revenues of that asset, which in many ways is a similar consequence.
I guess one area where I'm still having a hard time getting a grasp on is when we talk about China and debt restructure and so forth, is it the Chinese Communist Party that's, guiding the strings, or individual companies? And who really has the ability to make these decisions?
I think, when you see these, images on your screen of Xi Jinping addressing, the Belt and Road Forum and other such sort of big government events, you get the sense that the Belt and Road is centrally controlled. It's not. I think, there's a lot of Chinese players and actors involved in the Belt and Road. Sometimes you might have a Chinese province offering finance to a neighboring country, whereas at the same time, a Chinese state-owned construction company is also offering finance. And you see a lot of overlap, and that creates also these debt troubles. So there's the coordination of the Belt and Road is actually, not exactly there. And this is one of its failings, because it could lead to, as I said, overlap in debt and building up debt through different sources in China. But I think that the principal problem with the Belt and Road is that this debt that countries are taking on, we can't assume that all the projects that are being built actually produce new economic productive activities. And in order for debt to be sort of well spent, they need to produce those economic activities. The port in Sri Lanka is not attracting many ships. The railways in Kenya and Ethiopia, they're bringing in a lot of Chinese imports into these African countries, but they're not exporting a lot of Ethiopian and Kenyan goods out of the country. So the fact that they're not producing productive activities for the countries at hand, that's the biggest threat, I think, to the Belt and Road, and to your earlier question, towards the legitimacy of China's model. If we don't see some of these countries really benefit economically, developmentally, over the next sort of 10, 15 years, I think the Belt and Road will have been seen as a failure. And currently it's very hard to find, I think, a lot of clear standout positive cases in large projects in the Belt and Road. And, we will see in, I think, the next 10, 15 years how it all lands. But at the moment, for instance, one study by the Global Development Center in Washington, D.C. found that, out of 68 Belt and Road countries they studied, 23 countries are already in financial distress. And COVID-19 doesn't make this easier. I think particularly for the developing world, the economic downturn from COVID-19 is going to last longer than it does in the United States and Europe. So
let's talk for a moment, and I'll weave in some of these questions. A country that is not part of Belt and Road, I believe, still is India. But Pakistan is where there's one of the largest projects. So unpack that for us.
So Pakistan has always been China's so-called all-weather friend. And of course, as the Indian-Pakistani relationship has always sort of, since the separation of the Indian subcontinent, they've always been at odds. That really creates, negative impression in India towards the Belt and Road project. I think they feel that by China placing this, tens of billions of dollars in finance in Pakistan, that they're supporting, one of their regional rivals. Dating back to, Chinese and Pakistani collaboration on developing nuclear weapons and other sort of engagements in Kashmir. So it's a very testy relationship. But again, the Belt and Road Initiative in Pakistan, which is really one of the linchpin projects, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, is supposed to sort of build highways and roads, highways and railways, and even an oil pipeline through the length of Pakistan into Xinjiang in China. And really what that does is that it would bypass sort of choke points, sea choke points within Southeast Asia, like the Malacca Strait, so that Chinese bought oil from the Middle East in particular could more easily access that land route through Pakistan. But again, this hasn't moved forward as quickly as many perceived. Particularly the oil pipeline seems like a pipe dream at the moment. It's incredibly expensive. And the main region that it would pass through, Baluchistan in Pakistan, is quite unrestive. And there are insurgency groups that have threatened Chinese engineers on numerous occasions in the past several years. So it's a tricky project, and it's also meant that India has sort of woken up, in a sense, to China's ambitions within South Asia, its perceived region.
So we have a question from Ray Termini. We often do, and they're always good questions. Are China's overreach risks are China's overreach risk in many financial, geographic, and human rights areas, for example, creating a source of resistance to its global ambitions?
Yes, I mean, this is sort of one of the main drivers of the book. I wanted to look at how China deals with problems, and I wanted to see, how are countries responding when they disagree with China, and as the Belt and Road, I think, is a clear example. There are quite a number of projects now that have either been sort of reshaped by local governments to ensure that their countries got benefit from it, or they've been canceled altogether, or they've been downgraded significantly. So China has not been able to engage some of these countries on the Belt and Road, particularly democracies, very successfully. They haven't been able to engage with political opposition, with environmentalists, with civil society. And I think this is partly because a lot of the Chinese executives of state-owned enterprises don't have the same types of pressures they have at home. They have more power at home, more connections with government, and they're finding that they're getting entangled in local politics, and that's upsetting their interests.
We have a question from the Japan-America Society. What international or domestic Chinese actions, if any, could change the status quo in Xinjiang and the re-education centers?
Well, I mean, the re-education centers were a product of enormous overreaction from China's point of view. There have been, several terrorist attacks within China over the last sort of, not of late, but in the last sort of 15, 20 years, that led Xi Jinping to really put a net around the entire Uyghur society, and not just sort of the groups responsible for these attacks, but really everyone. Rolling that back, particularly in the face of just partial international pressure, I don't think is in the cards. I think it would take a really united, very broad coalition of countries, not only United States and Europe, but also Muslim countries, Middle Eastern countries, China's neighbors. It would really need to be a broad coalition, and we're not seeing that entirely take shape. I think there are many countries, even in the Islamic world, that haven't said much about Xinjiang and the atrocities that are taking place there. That being said, I mean, the pressure that the US and others are putting on China is helpful, and that needs to be maintained. But we also need to understand that there are countries, and some of them that have been partners to the United States in the past, like Saudi Arabia and others, that haven't been putting that pressure and that have sort of a higher moral standing on this issue than Americans or Europeans.
So we have a comment from an anonymous attendee, which makes me miss the fact when we were all be in a room together and we could have this person stand up and say this, but it's a good point. This viewer says, I get the sense that you are almost an apologist for China. 12 of the original Belt and Road nations have withdrawn due to repayment expectations in shoddy work. How do you respond to that?
Well, I think, we have to take a clear-eyed look at what's actually happening. Where I see the Belt and Road failing is that it's failing to do what the Chinese government wanted it to do. And those are threefold. They wanted the Belt and Road to help legitimize their developmental model, to give a new option to countries, as Xi Jinping has said. They wanted to sort of sell this as a way to bring countries into its foreign policy orbit. And I don't think that's happened. I think what we do see taking place is that countries in Africa, Southeast Asia, Latin America, they're close to China, but they're not interested in being sort of a client state of China. They are interested in balancing their relations with other foreign investors, be it Americans, Europeans, Japanese, Korean. They're interested in capturing what I see as, the diversity that's out there in the world today. And that includes China. But it's not sort of been a slam dunk for China's developmental model. Even after 4 years of President Trump in the White House, damaging American, polls have shown he's severely damaged views of the US around the world. But even after that time, a recent survey showed that of 18 African countries, that African countries would still like to follow the developmental model of the United States over China. So we have to take that into account, that I don't think China has sort of its strings attached to many of these countries. So that I think is a clear, I think, critical point on the Belt and Road. And we can discuss others, but I think China not being able to sell its model through this initiative has been a major failing.
Well, let's bring Anisha into the conversation, because I think this gets to what a lot of us would like to know is, how is the US competing? And Anisha says, can you compare China's approach to financing in the developing world to that of the US or the EU? And I'll ask you to really talk about the US, because I know we've changed somewhat the way that we're operating in our global investments development financing.
Well, the big sort of difference between, I think, American and Chinese finance to the developing world is transparency. The Chinese have very little. And this is one of their, again, something that I think upsets their own interests. That it really, we've been dealing with a black box when it comes to Chinese finance. And we're getting into the situation where countries that are coming into debt crisis, the IMF or World Bank or other lenders don't want to offer support because they're unaware of how much debt these countries have with China. So therefore, they don't want to fill this gap. I think the other big difference is you often hear of Chinese finance that it's no strings attached, right? No political strings attached. They won't pressure you to make governance reforms and other sort of conditionalities that the World Bank and Western aid, American aid, is often pegged with. But this isn't exactly true. Of course, firstly, there are political conditions. One of them is not recognizing Taiwan. Another is, there's a sort of a subtle conditionality that, criticism of China, of Xinjiang or Hong Kong or towards, its affairs with Taiwan, that's not going to be looked upon kindly either. And that's sort of implicitly, I think, in these deals as well. But mainly, the main, I think, condition, the main string attached to much of the Chinese finance is that the finance goes primarily to Chinese companies. So you'll see that loans often have conditions that say 75% of this finance will be given to these particular Chinese construction companies and to buy these Chinese exports. And this is where I see, the major sort of flaw, again, in China's Belt and Road Initiative, that it really crowds out a lot of the local private sector. So one study of Belt and Road projects found that 89% of the contractors in these Belt and Road projects are Chinese. Only 8% are local, whereas with the World Bank, 41% are normally local. So from the start of these agreements, there's a strict economic conditions that really solely benefit the Chinese. And that's another, I think, big difference. And that's an opportunity, I think, for American development cooperation and others to jump on, to help develop local firms, local companies, to engage more in these financial dealings.
We have about another 10, 12 minutes, and I'd love to explore how China uses what you call economic coercion. And we've seen that with Canada when there was the arrest of the executive from Huawei. We've certainly seen it in Australia when Australia's government started looking at how COVID-19 erupted. What can, and this is a question from one of our viewers, what can other countries do to counter China's, for lack of a better word, power grab?
Yeah, I think firstly is to understand that we're dealing often with psychological warfare here. So by that, I mean that often what China targets within these countries is a limited amount of economic trade or investment. So let me take an example. In Norway, for instance, after Norway, after the Nobel Peace Committee awarded the Nobel Peace Prize to a Chinese human rights dissident, China in response put a freeze to diplomatic relations with Norway and also stopped buying Norwegian salmon. And this, of course, has made headlines around the world for many years, that this is an example of China's economic coercion. In actuality, though, just putting sanctions on salmon really didn't have a major impact on the Norwegian economy. Of course, China is, the second largest economy in the world. All fishing nations would love to have, an open market to China and sell their products. But the salmon that was targeted, for example, it was measured at a loss of $1.3 billion US between 2000.
Did you find other markets though? I mean, what about the fishermen?
Sure. First of all, it only amounted to 0.3% of Norway's annual exports. And the fishermen were able to often sell their fish elsewhere because salmon in particular, in those years at least, there was a great global lack of supply. So, they could sell their fish almost anywhere. And as one, Norwegian, insider told me, the salmon industry guys were still driving Ferraris around Oslo. So this didn't have a major impact on the Norwegian economy. They're happy to sell salmon to China now, but it didn't really.
So what about Australia?
Australia is the same story. I mean, Bloomberg came out with a report today indicating that $3 billion was lost from China's pressure over the last year on Australia, banning, barley, beef, wine, and even coal. But Australia's exports total $257 billion. So again, a very small percentile. But I think this is a mentality, particularly I think in the United States and Europe, that we need to change, that we prioritize even these small amounts of trade and business to very high degrees. And we need to think more strategically, and we need to attach some value to whether it's a freedom of speech issue or a defense autonomy issue, that there's some value in those, and that we shouldn't allow a narrow amount of targeted trade to change our policy. So how can we respond then? One way, the long road, is WTO reform. That China has been able to get away with some of these sanctions because they use reasons such as health, sanitary issues. But this is the long road, and I think the Biden administration will kickstart those initiatives, whereas Trump, as many of your viewers know, I'm sure, abandoned the sort of WTO reform, even handicapped the organization by not engaging it. Another, I think, more quick fix that countries can do together is to, and this has been suggested by Japanese and American researchers alike, is to make a joint fund where allies who are targeted by China, be it Australia, Canada, or even countries like Sweden or the Czech Republic, which have been threatened with similar sanctions, that they can put funds together that can go to those industries that get affected by China to ensure that they don't go under, that jobs aren't lost for that period of time, until we get sort of international rules in order to handle these types of
I think it'd be hard
problems.
to see that type of cooperation, but that brings me to the role of the World Trade Organization. And let's remind our viewers, if this is still the case, that China is able to operate under very different rules than the EU or the United States, because it's still classified, what, as a developing nation, or?
I think, yes, China still has a status as a developing country. But in general, what China has done is it hasn't necessarily broken, I think, the rules of the WTO. Normally, when a case is brought towards it, it responds, positively to those results. What China has done is it's circumvented a lot of the rules. So it's gotten rid of tariffs, but it's added new non-tariff barriers like the health and sanitary issues that I brought up. So it sort of worked against the spirit, so to say, of the WTO. But I think, a joint fund between allies is less of a pipe dream than I think it was, 10 years ago. The numbers are adding up. Australia, Canada, South Korea, Japan. China has a lot of targets, has taken a lot of targets in the last sort of decade. And, I had one European official once tell me, well, we would never help this partner country in the EU if something like that happened to them. But just 2 years after that conversation, the EU is talking about an anti-coercion mechanism, so that something would kick in within the European Union if one of its member states was targeted by China or another country with such measures. That tariffs would be put, for example, on China or another foreign country. So it is growing discussion and these types of policies.
I wonder how that might play out with some of the things we used to have seen in the United States between Boeing and Airbus.
Well, this is, I think, a big issue, that if we want the WTO to work for everyone, we have to respect it. And Boeing and Airbus and the EU and the US will need to respect those results if they expect to also be able to convince China and push China to also accept these international rules.
We're going to be running out of time in a few minutes, and I do want to get to more of our viewer questions, so this will be more rapid fire. With all of the research and people that you know, what's your thoughts about COVID-19? Was it intentional or was it just negligence?
We don't know enough. I don't think we know enough yet, but I think it was negligence. I don't see necessarily any information to show that it was intentional, no.
You think it came from the lab, though?
Again, the problem is China has not been very transparent. We have, WHO investigation team there now, but they're a year, after this started, over a year, and they've been sort of, delayed repeatedly from doing their job. So this, this creates a problem for China, that people are going to believe the worst of that government should they continue to be so guarded.
What about, we hear from Anthony Mcclure, who would like to know, comment on China's actions in the South China Sea, economically and militarily? That could be a whole hour, another hour, but go ahead.
Well, the fear there is that, China could at some point in the, I don't think the USA, but at some point in the future, close off trade or close off particular countries' trade, such as Japan, Korea, where a lot of the oil and other resources to East Asian countries comes from. But that being said, we see that Asian countries, particularly India, Japan, Australia, along with the United States, but not only because of the United States, are collaborating more militarily. And this is a significant development. And I think Beijing would like to paint this as something that's been plotted in Washington, but it's not. Japan and India are keenly aware that they're in trouble should China continue to expand its military across Asian seas. And we've seen them cooperate at sort of unprecedented levels in recent years, even though their economic activity between one another is still quite underwhelming. Even the Southeast Asian countries, some of the countries that have disputes with China on these territorial islands and islets, even they have said sort of experts and sort of executives and officials that have been polled in those countries have said they would like their countries to join the so-called Quad, which is a very loose military security partnership between the United States, India, Japan, and Australia. And we see countries like Indonesia, even though they're engaging China economically, they're still pushing back on these security issues. So China hasn't won, I think, the hearts and minds of Southeast Asia.
And India's participation in military exercises just recently took place, I believe, for the first time.
Yes, the Malabar exercises in the Bay of Bengal involving all the 4 members of the Quad for the first time. This is.
We're going to have a. Go ahead. Sorry, I interrupted you. Please go ahead.
No, China will paint this as an Asian NATO, but this is, if it is an Asian NATO, it's an Asian NATO of Beijing's creation.
So we're going to have a really interesting program on March 23rd with Elliot Ackerman and Jim Stavridis, former admiral. I don't know if you're aware of this book, 2034, A Novel of the Next World War. Have you followed that at all?
No, sorry.
It'll be a book that you'll want to have on your nightstand. I've read many of Elliot's books, but clearly, I guess China does play a significant role. You do write in the book quite a bit about China's operations or efforts in the Middle East. Do you see a way that they may be able to influence the peace process? This is a question from Mo.
China has sort of had a long tradition of sort of sitting on the fence in these types of regional disputes or civil wars. I think that will continue for as long as they can. I think Beijing is still happy to free ride on American efforts to try to stabilize the Middle East. But we are sort of slowly over time seeing a more proactive China. But, you know, this is another big challenge for China, is it might be able to have amicable ties with Saudi Arabia and Iran, but it's not able to sort of create a partnership between those 2 countries. So and that's going to upset its economic.
You know, there's been a lot of give and take about whether or not President Biden will be tough on China. Will he be, and how should he be? That'll be my last question.
I think his tone towards China will change, and I think that will be welcomed by the Chinese and by many people abroad. But at the same time, I think that Biden will work with his allies as he says he will. The only thing I would add is that he doesn't just look across the Atlantic for those allies, but also across the Pacific. And you know, I would encourage, I think you know, his incoming administration is already switched on to this, but partnerships with India, with Japan, and with Southeast Asia are going to be much more influential during the 21st century than traditional ones over the Atlantic.
Well, one thing's for sure, we really do appreciate the time you spent with us today. And it's good to meet you, and now all of us can follow your writings in the Financial Times, etc. I want to encourage everyone to purchase a copy of your book. You can go to interrobangbooks.com. And again, the title is How China Loses, to get that 10% off. Thanks again for being with us, and we'll see you again, hopefully tomorrow. Have a great day.